So it's like, who could have did this?
This was a violent struggle that took place in that bedroom.
Hey guys, my name's Emily. Thank you for clicking onto my video. I hope you've all enjoyed the Christmas period, but today's case is of a taxi driver who killed 7 women, with 2 of them being pregnant. Now let's just jump into it. Paul DeRusso was born on the 11th of August 1970. He was from Beaumont, Texas. I really hope I'm saying that right. But his family had moved to Los Angeles after his dad had deserted them. And even still then, they never really stayed in a place for longer than a year because they were moving from place to place throughout California. So not really at any school long enough to make any friends, or really no point in making any friends because he just wasn't there long enough. So all he pretty much knew was his mum. And even then, that was still limited because she had worked all the hours that she could get. So essentially, he spent his childhood alone. After graduating high school, he had got himself a job as a security guard at the age of 18 years old. And although this was a stable and consistent job, this wasn't good enough for Paul. This didn't bring the excitement that he thought that this job would bring. So he'd carry around guns, and he literally got caught red-handed. And by that, I mean he went out on the street with a gun in his hand and was caught by the police. But for some reason, he never got done. Obviously, he got the gun taken away from him, but there was no consequences. But he'd not just been caught once, he had been caught twice. But even still then, on the second time, he wasn't done. He just had the gun taken away from him. It's just baffling. How has he been caught not once, but twice in possession of a firearm, and yet nothing is done? I'm not too sure if this scared him straight or not, but he then enrolled himself into the US Army, where he was originally stationed in Germany, and this is where he met his wife Nicola, who he married in 1995. In 1996, Paul and his wife had been transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia. They'd been given a house on the base, and this is where they had their 2 daughters. So life was picture perfect from the outside, but on the inside, he was nothing but just a horrible little bastard. But she wasn't the only one. And on the 13th of March, 1997, Paul had been arrested for the rape and kidnap of a young woman. And although the charges had been dropped because there wasn't enough evidence, he had actually been caught in possession of stolen goods, to which he was court-martialed. And in January of 1999, Paul had been found guilty and was dishonourably discharged from the US Army. It hadn't just stopped at one victim though, because in September of 1997, a nude body of a woman had been found raped and murdered in Fort Benning. She had been found on the 7th of September by a member of the public who was just walking their dog. And this was 26-year-old Tracy Habersham. The last time that anybody had heard of her was 2 days previous when she had gone to a party. Paul had not been seen as a suspect at the time. After Paul had been dishonourably discharged, he, his wife and his 2 children decided to move down to where his wife's hometown was, which is Jacksonville, Florida. This was just around the corner from her parents' house. They had done this for a fresh start, for a second chance. But a leopard never changes their spots, so to speak. But he was still the same abusive arsehole. He also never seemed to be able to hold down a job, which means that they struggled to make ends meet. It was known that the couple would often argue about their money issues. He would have multiple affairs, he would shout, he would hit, he would just purely abuse his wife. And by 1999, she had just had enough. He had apparently put her up against the wall by her throat and slapped her across the face. The police were actually called, to which they advised her on how to file a restraining order against him, although it would still take her a few years to realise that this man was just a piece of shit. However, in that year, 24-year-old Teresa Mack had been found raped and strangled to death in her apartment. Her sister had called round to see if she was okay. Now, the reason for her visit is because Teresa had never picked up her children from daycare, and her younger child had an appointment at the doctor's that afternoon that she missed. Now, she was a devoted parent, and her sister knew that she wouldn't just miss any of that for no reason.
This particular day, she was supposed to get them from school because the baby had an appointment. Well, at 5, they brought them to my grandmother's house.
So she continuously kept knocking on her sister's door because she knew that she was in there. She had this gut feeling that she knew something was wrong, but she knew she was in there. So she knocked onto her sister's neighbour's door and asked, "Have you seen my sister?" And he said, "Yeah, I did. I see them this morning with the kids going out, but I've not seen her since then." So she had convinced him to boot the door down, which they did. And when they went in, the house seemed normal, it seemed quiet, clean, but that was until that they got to Teresa's room. And what she saw was her sister on the bed, half naked, with holes in the rest of her clothes. She had a phone cord wrapped around her neck. I can't even imagine what that would have been like for her sister to see. But she ran out and she called the police. It was clear to the police that Teresa had been through the most horrific and brutal attack. They had found that she had an abrasion on her face that had basically scraped the skin off her nose. They had also found marks on her wrists, showing that she'd actually been tied up, probably with the cord that she was strangled with. They'd also collected evidence of semen from Teresa too. While carrying out their search, they had noticed that she had a ring mark, but there was no ring about. It had also looked like that he had stolen her TV. The fucking audacity of him. He comes in, does what he does, and robs her too. The police didn't know what to think, but what they did know is that this wasn't a forced entry. So did Teresa know who had murdered her, who had raped her? Did she know her attacker?
She don't even let strangers in her house. So it had to be somebody she kind of knew and we just didn't know.
However, the police did actually think at first that robbery was the prime motive. Teresa Mack was born in 1975. She was the third child born out of 6 siblings, and they grew up in Jacksonville. And she had 3 beautiful babies herself, which she single-handedly raised. She worked her ass off for the life that her and her babies had. She was very hardworking and determined. She had such an outgoing personality, and if you haven't guessed it, she was one amazing mummy to all her children. That morning, she had a job interview, and after, she spent some of the day job hunting, but with no success, so she just went home. Some of her neighbours had been interviewed, and some witnesses had said that they'd seen a man coming out of her apartment with a TV and got into a car and sped off. Teresa's family had given the names of 4 men to the police who was around her at that point, but because they hadn't been positively ID'd and by their DNA, they were all ruled out as suspects. Speaking of DNA, yeah, they did have the killer and rapist DNA, but because the DNA wasn't on their database, they wasn't able to know who it was. So essentially, they were back to square one. Her case was then forced to be sadly known as a cold case for 4 long years until Paul went on his murderous rampage. On the 1st of January, New Year's Day of 2003, Nakia Kilpatrick's family had been waiting for a message or a phone call from her. As normal, we all text our family or our friends to say Happy New Year or give them a call, but they had not received one. This then made them worry, and by 10 p.m. that night, they went round to her house and knocked on the door. They waited for a response, but there was none. There was no lights on in the house, there was no movement, there was no noise. They knocked on the door a few more times before going to the back window, knocking on the window and coming back round again to knock on the door. The commotion that they were making actually caused one of Nakia's neighbours to come out and see what was going on. But he was actually quite a close friend of hers. They spent pretty much every day with each other. But she had come out and said the same thing and confirmed that no one had seen Nakia in the past couple of days. They were all chatting about the last time that they'd actually seen Nakia, when all of a sudden they heard a noise which sounded like it came from the front room. So they all went round to the window where the front room was, and they had seen Nakia's eldest child, which at the time, he was only 2 years old. He seemed to be quite distressed. Her neighbour had actually looked through the blinds, and even though they were down, there was a few little slits that you could still see through. And she said that the whole house was a complete and utter mess. They all knew something was wrong. They felt it in the pit of their stomach. They knew they needed to get in that house. Because let's face it, she's not answering. Her child is in distress knocking at the window, and he wasn't the only child that she had. She had an 11-month-old baby boy too. So they did what I think most parents and friends would do and booted her door down. And the moment that they did, they were overcome with the most foulest smell that they've ever smelled. And her 2-year-old little boy came running out to them, followed by the 11-month-old baby crawling out of another room. They called out for Nakia, but she didn't answer. They went room to room trying to find her. And when they got to the hallway, they found her daughter. She had been murdered, and it was clear that she had been brutally attacked. Nakia still had the telephone cord wrapped around her neck. Her ankles and her wrists were bound too. She had cuts and bruises all over her, suggesting that this was a really brutal struggle. Nakia was 6 months pregnant at the time, and due to her being murdered, sadly, her baby's life was taken too. It'd been very clear that due to the way that the kids had been found and how decomposed Nakia's body was, they had been there for a couple of days. Them poor babies, I can't even imagine what was going through their little heads. I mean, they're barely old enough to go to the toilet or feed themselves. And they were just left there with their mum like that to fend for themselves. The police had honestly believed that if these 2 boys hadn't been found when they were found, they could have starved to death. But thankfully, if it hadn't have been for Nakia's mum and dad and the worry that they had for their daughter, who knows what would have generally happened to them. As the investigation went on, they had found that there was no forced entry into Nakia's apartment. And the door was locked because obviously the parents had to boot the door down to gain entry. So did he take the key, or did he already have a key? I'm not really too sure, but hear me out on this one. Although this is not being touched on, there was a ring missing from the first murder and now a key missing from the second murder. Could these be his trophies? Now, apart from what I've just mentioned, there was no other evidence that was found in her apartment. However, now when Nakia's body had gone down for an autopsy, they had discovered that she had been violently raped on top of everything that she'd already been through. Thankfully, investigators were able to pull a DNA sample from the semen that was left from the rape. However, when they had put this DNA sample through the system, it was a match to absolutely no one, just as yet. The man that they were looking for had either not been known to the police or had never been caught or arrested at all. They then started to interview all of her friends and her family, but no one knew nothing. And 8 days later, they got another call to say that another nude body of a woman had been found, raped and strangled to death. This crime almost seemed identical to Nakia's murder, and this was 20-year-old nurse assistant Shawanda McAllister, who had actually been found by her boyfriend Rashid. He had been out that day and had come home around 12 p.m, but he had realised that he hadn't got his key. So he knocked on the door, but she hadn't answered. So unless he wanted to kip out in the hallway, he had to find some way of getting into the place. And when he did, he realised why his girlfriend didn't answer the door. He had found her naked from the waist down. She had had a cord wrapped around her neck and both her ankles and her wrists were bound. The police had been immediately called, and when they got there, they started their search. And they had found a condom that had been used only a few feet away from Shawanda's body. They had assumed that this was the condom and semen of the killer. This was just one of the 2 bits of evidence that they had collected from her apartment. The second was an ATM receipt that showed that Shawanda had got $200 out at around 8:30 p.m. that night. The police had then managed to get the CCTV from the ATM machine, and it showed Shawanda getting her money out, but it also showed a taxi that was behind her. But they couldn't make out what taxi firm it actually was. Shawanda had been taken down for an autopsy, and she had been found in the same way that Nakia had been found, and she too was pregnant, but sadly, because she died, her baby had sadly died as well. So 2 women in the matter of 8 days who were pregnant were violently raped and murdered in their own home. The police had then thought, with them being pregnant, maybe that was something to do with the reason why these women were targeted and killed. But the thing that linked them all together was a very specific detail, and this was the way that the slip knot was tied. It was very uncommonly used. So with that, the police knew that these 2 cases were connected, that both these women had been raped and murdered by the same man. And this was confirmed when they had sent the semen sample collected from Shawanda to be tested, only to find out that the sample had matched Nakia's sample, but not anything else, because this man wasn't in the system. So he was still at large. So the police had come up with a theory, because it was the only thing really that they could think of, because Nakia and Shawanda only lived a mile apart. And maybe, just maybe, Rashid, Shawanda's boyfriend, had been sleeping with them both. So the police had interviewed him again, and he came back with quite an out there story. He said that he'd come back during the day and Shawanda had been blaring music. Now this was odd because she didn't normally do this. And not only that, he heard a man's voice. So he started knocking on the door and saying, "What are you doing? Who's in there? I can hear somebody. What are you doing?" Shawanda had actually answered the door, to which he then asked her all of these questions. And she said, "Don't worry, it's okay. I'll explain it all later. You just need to go." Well, that's the third red flag really, isn't it? The first one being her blaring music and she doesn't normally listen to music like that. The second one being the man's voice. And the third one, her telling him to get out of there. But with all of that going on, he was quite confused. And all he said was, "I need to get my work gear, I've left it in there." And she said, "I'll get it for you and leave it outside," which she did. He hung around for a little bit, just thinking, what the hell, what was going on? Is she cheating on me? She's got to be cheating on me. She's in there with a man. He started chatting through the letterbox saying, "How could you do this? You are pregnant with my child. We're supposed to be a family. How could you do this?" But he had only done this for a short time because he had to go to work. So he left thinking that his girlfriend was cheating on him. But little did he know that he was a hell of a lot worse than what he originally thought. So with that crazy story, they'd asked Rashid if he'd do a polygraph test, which he did and he passed. But they'd also asked him for his DNA to test against the DNA that they had on the system, and it wasn't a match. So Rashid was actually cleared as a suspect, which then put the police right back where they started, with nothing to go on. They had started to interview Shawanda's neighbours, and they had said that Shawanda had been getting in and out of taxis all day, and that they'd seen a man leaving her house to get in a taxi around 11 p.m, but they assumed this to be Rashid. But it wasn't. So it had given the police around about a time of when the killer had left Shawanda's apartment. Investigators had their suspicions that this wasn't this killer's first murders. They seemed to have been killed by somebody who had previous experience, who had killed more than one person. So they started to look into cases that were similar to Nakia's and Shawanda's, and thank God that they did, because they had come across an unsolved case of a woman who was murdered and left in a ditch. And this was 18-year-old Nicole Williams. Her body had been found on the 19th of December 2002, 2 days after she had been reported missing on the 17th of December. She had been discovered 2 weeks before Nakia's body had been found, but this one was just a little bit different, because she had been found wrapped up in a blue blanket. Now at first I generally thought, oh, maybe he'd done this because he cared about her. No, I was completely wrong. It turned out that this blanket was from a hotel motel type of thing. So he must have murdered her and raped her in this motel hotel sort of thing and wrapped her up in it and disposed of her. Investigators had tied all these cases together through, you guessed it, DNA. The semen that had been collected from Nakia and Shawanda's body had also been collected from Nicole's body too. So she too had been raped and murdered by this evil fuck. And he was still on the loose. No one knew who this man was. He was dangerous. He was raping and murdering women, and he didn't even care whether you had kids or not, or you were pregnant or not. He was so dangerous, and he needed to be caught. But because his DNA wasn't on the system, they didn't know who the fuck he was. And I wish I could say that that was it. But no, that's not the case. Because on the 5th of February 2003, the police had had a phone call from some construction workers. See, when they had gotten into work, they had heard these dogs barking. They didn't really think much of it until they kept on barking and kept on barking. So one of the construction workers thought, right, I'm going to go investigate, see what the commotion is about. And when he got there, the dogs had moved, and he had seen a body of a dead woman and called the police immediately. When the police arrived, they conducted a search, but what they didn't expect to find was a second body. Clearly, he felt safe disposing them there, considering they both hadn't been found until then. The two women that had been found were 17-year-old Giovanna Jefferson and 18-year-old Sarita Cohen. They too were very similar cases, and they were two beautiful black young women who had both been raped, had both been strangled to death, and both had had their hands and their ankles tied. As the investigation went on, they had found out that Giovanna was actually missing for a couple of weeks, which led them to believe that she had been murdered on the day that she had been reported missing, which was on the 20th of January. But she had just not been found until the 5th of February. Giovanna was last seen at a party on the 20th of January. Her friends said that they had last saw her getting into a taxi. However, she never made it home. See, Giovanna didn't live alone. And when she didn't return home, her auntie had got really worried, so she rang her phone. But it wasn't Giovanna on the other end of the line. And they had said, Giovanna will be home shortly. And when asked who was this, all they said was Dee, and put the phone down. And that was it. Giovanna's family didn't hear anything until the 5th of February, when her body had been found. Sarita, on the other hand, is believed to have been murdered 10 days after Giovanna was. Investigators didn't really have much to go on, but the one thing that they did have that was consistent throughout all these stories was a taxi firm. So when witnesses were asked, what taxi firm was this? What taxi firm were they getting in? And they all said the same thing: Gator City Taxis. It was literally the biggest lead that they had since they had gathered the evidence from the semen to connect all these rapes together. So with that, investigators went straight down to Gator City Taxis to find out as much information that they could. And they found that one of their taxi drivers had just been recently hired, and his name was Paul DeRusso. His first day had so happened to be the day that Shawanda had been raped and murdered. So his first day, he abused his trust and raped and murdered one of his customers. This explains how he was able to get in and out of the victim's places, apartments, flats, whatever he was getting into, without being detected. But when investigators had found out what Paul DeRusso's name was, they thought maybe this was the D that Nakia's family was talking about, and maybe it in fact had been Paul DeRusso. He was investigators' main suspect, so they started to look a little bit deeper into his background, into his past. But while they were doing that, they had actually found out that Paul was the one that drove Giovanna and Sarita around the day that they disappeared. So with that, the police had arrested him immediately. He had been taken in for questioning about the murders of these women and his whereabouts, but throughout the entire interview, he just said no comment to everything that he was asked. But with him being arrested, they was finally able to take his DNA. However, they still had to wait a little bit of a time because this was 2003 and not everything was as quick as what it is now back then. But by law, they couldn't hold him without any evidence. And if they didn't have the evidence from the DNA, well, it was kind of tough luck. But they had a few more pieces of evidence up their sleeve that would hold him in for the murders of these women. And this was by Giovanna and Sarita's phone records. See, what they had done was find out the location when they disappeared on their phone and matched it to Paul DeRusso's location. and it matched. They was in the same place at the same time. They'd also found little blue fibres that was in Paul's car. Blue fibres that had matched up to the blanket that Nicole Williams was found in. Also, when the victims had been found with a cord around their neck, this had been done with a specific slipknot. A slipknot that was taught to people in the US Army. And if you remember, Paul DeRusso did a stint in the early 1990s. They had gathered a lot of evidence, but by that time, the DNA evidence had come back, and it had proved that Paul DeRusso had in fact been the one to murder and rape all of these women. And in June of 2003, he had been charged with 5 counts of murder and 2 counts of child abuse. This was because that he'd left Nikia's 2 young children locked in a house with their dead mother. Investigators had also found out about the murder of Tracy Havisham and Theresa Mack, and they had linked them to Paul. So he was now being done and charged for 7 murders. However, he was only going to be tried for the murder of Theresa Mack. And this was because of the witnesses and the evidence. See, her case was the one that was going to get him sentenced. And although the other cases, they weren't tried separately, they were brought in this trial as evidence to help convict him. I mean, I get it. They wanted him behind bars no matter the cost. But it could have been argued that the semen that were found on these women were from consensual sex. I mean, it wasn't. We all know it wasn't. But it could have been argued. They weren't taking no risks. So with the witnesses and the evidence from Theresa Mack, he stood trial for her murder. They must have thought taking this man out any which way possible that they could would be better than letting him out on the streets to do what the fuck he wanted to do again. Thankfully they did, because the jury had seen straight through him and he had been sentenced to death by lethal injection. But somehow he skipped out on it. And in 2007, his death sentence had been overturned, and he now serves life in prison. It hardly seems like justice, really, does it, when he was originally sentenced to death for his crimes? I'll say it before, and I'll say it again. People like him need to be shown the mercy that he gave his victims, which was none. So he should be shown none. Paul unfortunately still lives, but he will spend the remainder of his life behind bars, and I hope it's a living fucking hell. And that's today's case. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions down in the comment box. I mean, personally, I will forever be baffled by the mind of killers, especially ones who hide in plain sight. I mean, the ones that have a family and just live a normal life like they're normal. Paul has 2 daughters of his own. But yeah, that didn't stop him from raping and murdering 7 women and possibly even more, leaving 2 children to fend for themselves after he raped and murdered their mother. I mean, how the fuck can somebody do that? It just baffles me, man. I mean, I for one hope he is living a life of hell. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to my certain viewers who have been commenting and have supported me throughout the entire time. And that is Candy Goon, Anne-Marie and Thomas Buckingham. I truly appreciate the support. It means more to me than you actually know. But for now, that's it, guys. And until next time, I'm gonna love you and leave you. Bye!